I grew up in Portland in the 90s, long before indie rock was a genre of music, long before third wave coffee, and long before Southeast was cool. And I remember this bumper sticker that was ubiquitous back in the day. It said this: practice random acts of kindness. Anybody remember that? It's on the back of every hybrid, before there was a hybrid, the pre-hybrid Subaru, right? Which is alive and well in this city. It's on the back of all over the place. Practice random acts of kindness. And that, in my opinion, is how lots of people read the stories about Jesus in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In particular, the stories about Jesus healing the sick and casting out demons and the miraculous. Lots of people read all those stories as if the point is basically, one, Jesus is God, and two, Jesus is nice. And while I very much believe that Jesus is the embodiment of the Creator God come among us, that's what we remember at Christmas time. And while I very much believe that Jesus is nice, sometimes, not always, at the same time, I think that in these stories, there's so much more underneath the surface. It's absolutely critical that we read this story right here in Mark 9 about Jesus and a boy and his dad inside the larger story that is the Gospel of Mark, and that we read the Gospel of Mark inside the larger story that is Genesis to Revelation, or what I call the meta-narrative of Scripture. Now, that story breaks down into three movements: creation, decreation, and recreation. Now, if you've been around for any longer than 3 weeks, you're thinking, oh no. Here we go again. John Mark and his obsession with the meta-narrative. That guy needs a psychologist. For starters, I already have one, all right, in my defense. And we're working on this. But secondly, we are actually. But secondly, all I ask is that you give me 10 minutes, all right? 10 minutes of pain, torture. And I'm so sorry to drag you through the scriptures again. But all I ask is for 10 minutes of your time to set this story right here inside the much larger story of God. 10 minutes, start your clock. Here we go. Three movements. First off, movement one, creation. In Genesis 1 and 2, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a way of saying everything. And when he finished up, he said, it is very, what? Good. And early on it was. Human was ruling over the earth, under God over the earth, and he was in harmony, in sync, in tune with God and with one another, Adam and Eve and the family, and with the earth itself. Now, the Hebrew word for this state of affairs is what? Anybody know? Shalom, well done, which literally means peace or wholeness or delight or wonder or joy. It's a way of saying the world as God intended it, the world as it's supposed to be. And even today in 2013, there are echoes of this ancient world, right? All over the place in what I would call shalom moments. When you're with your family around the Christmas tree and there's a fire in the fireplace. Don't judge me for the trees or whatever, but I love it. And you're there and you're filled with delight. When you're around a table with your friends and your mouth is full of food and you're filled with conversation. The other day when I was wrestling with my 3 kids and my oldest, Jude, who's 8, was there on the ground and I was tickling him and he was busting up with laughter and squealing with joy, that feeling in my heart, that is a shalom moment. Now, all of life used to be like that. It was called Eden. But sadly, we don't live in Eden anymore because movement 1, creation, was followed by movement 2, decreation. In Genesis 3, human joined the Satan, who was and is a malevolent spiritual being in rebellion against God. Human joined him in rebellion against God, and as a result, sin infected the human race, and it spread, and it wreaked havoc. And now, in the wake of that, human is out of harmony, out of sync, out of tune with God, but not only that, with each other, and then with the earth itself. And today, this world that we live in is marked by the word injustice. Now, injustice is the exact opposite of shalom. It's the world as it's not supposed to be. Today, it looks like poverty, it looks like disease, it looks like malnutrition, it looks like the infant death rate, it looks like the corruption of government in the developing world, and more in the developed world, so-called developed world. It's illiteracy, it's the implosion of the nuclear family. It's fatherlessness. It's the lack of opportunity. It's the lack of education. It's no clean water. It's no access to health care. Put all of that together, and it's the anti-Eden. It's the world out of joint, and sadly, it's the new normal. But the good news, or what Jesus called the gospel, is movement 3, recreation. Starting in Genesis 12 and then to the right, God called a man named, anybody know? Anybody know? Abraham. Somebody, you get paid, Ian. You're preaching this in a couple hours. That's not fair. Abraham, and he said this, shall I hide? This is from Genesis 18. This is God speaking. Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? His rescue of the world. Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, Israel, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. That's God's agenda. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to do what? How is God going to rescue the world through this family? Listen. To keep the way of the Lord. How? By doing what is right and just. Read that sentence out loud with me. By doing what is right and just, so that, here's the end result, the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him, which is what? All nations on earth will be blessed through you. Now, notice the language, right and just. Sadak and mishpat in Hebrew, or righteousness and justice in English. Now, these two words, sadak and mishpat, righteousness and justice, are a word pair. They're two sides of a coin, and they are used dozens and dozens and dozens of times all over, in particular, what we call the Old Testament. I read it in the first line of my psalm this morning. Now, righteousness has to do with the community. It basically means right relationships. When you read that word righteousness, think in your mind right relationships with God, with one another, and with the earth. It's when all of those relationships are marked by shalom. They are as God intended in the beginning. Now, justice has more to do with the individual. I love Dr. Bashir's definition of justice. Quote, inconveniencing yourself for the good of the, quote, worthless person. Specifically, the widow, the poor, and the stranger. It's the trifecta we read about in the Torah. In today's language, the single mom, the foster child, the immigrant to the United States of America. I love this quote from Old Testament scholar Bruce Waltke. The righteous, and the same could be said of the just, are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. The wicked, or the unjust, are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. That's the idea. And this is what Abraham and his family, Israel, are called to do what is right and just. Or put another way, in my language, to partner with God for the healing and restoration of the world. That's Israel, which is a way of saying God's people's calling or job description, if you would, to partner with God for the work of healing and restoration. Now, here's the problem. Is Israel a success or a failure? Yes, right? But when it comes to justice, for the most part, she is a failure. Read the prophets. The number one indictment is idolatry, and the number two indictment is injustice. Over and over and over again, the prophets castigate Israel for idolatry and injustice. Idolatry, you worship other gods, and you oppress the poor and the vulnerable. I think of Isaiah chapter 1, a few quick snapshots. Wash, make yourselves clean. This is God speaking. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do sadak, righteousness. Seek justice, or mishpat. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow, which you guys are doing. I'm so proud of you. I think of Amos. It's too early in the morning to make a joke about his name. I don't think that would fly at the 8. Anyway, 4. But tonight, they're going to love it. 4, 3 sins of Israel. Even for 4, I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver. This is what God's angry about. And the needy for a pair of sandals. Man, I just keep thinking of Forever 21. They trample on the heads of the poor. Seriously, that is an issue. As on the dust of the ground, and deny justice to the oppressed. And of course, there's the well-known Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's it. That's the prophet's summary of, hey, here's what it means to be the people of God. You act justly, or that can be translated do justice. That is number one on his list. What does it mean to be the people of God? Well, number one, you do justice, and you love mercy, and you walk humbly with your God. But in spite of this, prophecy after prophecy, Israel is a success and she is a failure when it comes to injustice. So the prophets start envisioning a coming king called the Messiah who would do justice. I think of Psalm 99, one more prophecy. This is speaking of the future in the past tense, which is weird to us, but it's business as usual in Hebrew poetry, all right? And listen to this prophecy. The king, this is the Messiah, is mighty, and he loves justice. That's what he will be like. You have established equity. In Jacob, you have done Sadak and Mishpah, or what is right and just, or righteousness and justice, that word pair over and over and over. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. He is holy. This is a prayer bending time, looking over the horizon to the coming of the one true king who would do justice. Now, fast forward to Jesus, all right? Jesus is the embodiment of Psalm 99. He comes as the king, or as the Messiah, as the king who, quote, loves justice. Who does Jesus spend the bulk of his time with? Yeah, those in need of justice, the sick, from disease, the demonized, the cast off, the vulnerable, and his work is one of healing and restoration, or what the Hebrew prophets would call justice, righteousness and justice. So much so that by the end of the story, if you read Revelation, which is also about Jesus, we read about the healing and the restoration of the whole creation, not just a little boy here and a father there, and the entire cosmos from top to bottom. We read about a world with no injustice, no corruption, no pain, no disease, in fact, no death, a world of life forever in God's presence. We read about the return to Eden, the return to shalom, the return to life as God intended it to be. And in Mark, right here in the Gospels, we read about the genesis of this creation ride healing, of it breaking in through one story, another story, a healing, a freedom, a miracle, all through Jesus of Nazareth. Now that is how you read a story like this, the one right in front of you, inside the larger story. That was 11 minutes. I almost made it, but not too bad, all right? 11. Now, with that in mind, let's work through the text right in front of you, okay? You live out there? You survived that? All right, thank you for your grace, all right? Mark chapter 9, verse 14, let's work through it. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. So remember last week, Jesus was up on the mountain with the trifecta, Peter, James, and John. Right here, they come down the mountain to a disaster. The disciples, or what's left of the disciples, the other 9, or who knows how many, are arguing with the teachers of the Torah. About what? Well, keep reading. 15. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder. Who knows why? And they ran to greet him. Like children, right? They ran to greet him. What are you arguing with him about? He asked. A man in the crowd answered, Teacher, Rabbi, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Literally, it's a dumb spirit. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. So there's this boy in the story who's demonized. He's possessed, the text flat out says, by a spirit, which is a synonym for a demon. Now, if you're new to the whole thing, a demon, we believe, is basically an invisible but real, malevolent spiritual being at war with God, all right? And it's not out of a movie or a fairy tale or Peter Jackson. It's actually out of reality, all right? And we live in a secular society, and it's hard to buy that. And if you're thinking, yeah, I don't know if I buy it, well, travel a bit more. It's true. Trust me. But this boy is possessed by a demon. Now, scholars argue back and forth. Some think this right here was a demonic manifestations. Others argue, no, this was epilepsy. I mean, read it. This is, if you're a doctor, this is symptomatic of epilepsy, plain and simple. But that either-or dichotomy is a late modern Western way of thinking, not a first century Hebrew way of thinking. We think of the demonic and disease as two separate things. But in a Hebrew worldview, and that of Jesus, there's overlap between the two. Sometimes something is just demonic, and that's all. Other times something is just disease. It's not demonic, it's just cancer, or it's this, or it's that, or the other. But sometimes it's both. In fact, often they bleed into each other and allied over one another, as is the case here. But the disciples, it's interesting, could not expel this spirit or this demon, which is weird because they could before. Remember? We read about just a chapter or two ago, read about how they were all the time casting out demons, but not here. What is up with this? Well, keep reading. 19, this is what Jesus says. "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied. "How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you?" This is where, like, the Mr. Rogers Jesus doesn't quite fit the stereotype, right? Like, there is that side of Jesus with the children. And then there's this side. How long, seriously, shall I put up with you? But there's something here. I mean, you unbelieving generation. Jesus is a man of faith in the middle of a generation that doesn't have any. And he's frustrated, he's angry, he's upset. This idea of how long shall I be with you? Now, this isn't Jesus saying, how long until I get out of here and I'm done with you? Good grief. Go back to the Father. You guys are such a pain, right? There might be a little bit of that in there. But essentially what Jesus is getting at is he's sensing in the Spirit, my guess is, that his time is coming to a close. I mean, now Mark is now turning and Jesus is on the way to the cross and the resurrection. And he's sensing, listen, I don't know how much longer I have left. Maybe a year, maybe 6 months, maybe 3, maybe a few weeks. How long until you guys are going to get it? I mean, we don't have that much time left. You're my disciples. You're supposed to carry on this whole kingdom of God thing. And you don't even believe. You can't even cast out a demon? Seriously, come on. How long until you're going to get it? And he's frustrated and he's upset. And listen to what Jesus says. "Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Interesting, you know, sometimes stuff gets worse before it gets better. Right? Sometimes you bring the boy to Jesus. You bring your problem, you bring your issue, you bring your prayer, you bring the demonization, you bring the pain, you bring the injustice, you bring the suffering to Jesus, and you start to pray, and it gets worse. And it's foaming at the mouth, rolling around on the ground. You're thinking, Jesus, I brought the boy to you. But that's how it works. Sometimes it gets worse. But if you keep reading, it does get better. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him." Interesting, the agenda. "But if you can do anything, take pity on us," or that can be translated, have compassion on us and help us. If you can do, Jesus, if you can do anything, there's story after story about you up and down Galilee. If you can do anything, please take pity, have compassion on us. And then listen to this, 23. "If you can," said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. He's toying with the Father. He's coaxing out the man's faith. Really, if you can? Is that the best you have? Is that the best you can do? If you can do anything, Really? He's coaxing out the man's faith. Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, so right there, it was under the surface, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." Man, in this moment, the Father was speaking for how many of us, right? That mixture that we all feel, in particular in a time of crisis as followers of Jesus. That mixture of faith and doubt. I do believe, kind of. Sort of, but I'm no Abraham. I do believe. Help me. I feel like that all the time. Help me overcome my unbelief. 25, when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, it's getting larger and larger, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," that's Jesus' name calling, I love it, "you idiot, I command you, get out of him and never enter him again. Interesting. It says that repossession is a possibility. The spirit, listen to this, shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. Okay, once again, it gets worse before it gets better. Why? Because there is an invisible but real conflict, war, struggle all around you 24/7 in spirituality, right? The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said he's dead. And the language here in Greek is ambiguous. It's not clear if he's dead or if he's unconscious. But either way, 27, Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. More literally, it's Jesus raised him up and he was resurrected. That's more literally in the original language. This right here is a signpost in Mark's writing forward to the resurrection of Jesus and the power that Jesus' resurrection and the coming of the Spirit unleashed on the world. He raised him up and he was resurrected. Now, 28, listen to the ending. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately. This is a Mark thing, and in his writing style, all the secret stuff is indoors in the house. Ooh, okay, now we're about to learn something secretive. We're about to learn Jesus the rabbi and his disciples are inside a house. Okay, what's about to happen? Why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, and this is the poignant line, this kind can come out only by prayer. Now, that's not how people thought in Jesus' day. Demonization was a rampant problem in the ancient Mediterranean, as it still is in much of the developing world today, and more in the West, in particular in the Northwest, as we open up to spirituality, which, contrary to what a lot of Western Christians think, is real. But just because somebody's having a spiritual experience does not mean it's with the Spirit, capital S, of the Creator God. It may or may not very well be with a spirit, lowercase s, who is at war with the Creator God. But the more and more that we, even here in the West, open up to quote-unquote spirituality, the more we're going to see stuff like this. And exorcism, at least in Jesus' world, was an elaborate cocktail of an incantation and a spell and a potion and a power play and name calling and a root and a spice and feces, all this crazy stuff. It was a technique. And the disciples, essentially what we think Mark is getting at, is that the disciples thought that the power over the demonic was found in technique. Hey, we're disciples of Jesus, therefore we have the power and authority of Jesus, and we do this and we do that and we do the other, and boom. But then they do this and they do that and they do the other, and nothing. What's up? Jesus is saying, no, you have it all wrong. The power, it's not from a technique. Are you out of your mind? I just stand up and say, you're dumb, get out. The power, it comes from prayer, which is interesting because does Jesus pray in this story? No, there's no, Jesus, we want to stop right now as the kid's rolling around on the ground and just pray and blah, 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 and then, okay, now we're done. No, it's not there. Meaning what? Meaning that the kind of prayer Jesus is getting at is an ongoing, continuous, under the surface, in the back of your head, without ceasing, Paul would call it, kind of free-flowing life of intimacy with God. That's where it's at. Because to Jesus, prayer is not a weapon. Oh, yeah? Right? No. Jesus is nonviolent, by the way. No, prayer to Jesus is a way to get close to the Father, to wrap yourself up in God's presence. And from that, from intimacy with God, you get power and authority along with Jesus over the demonic world. This kind can come out only by prayer. Now, let's take a step back and think about this story from the vantage point of Jesus' work not only against the demonic, which is crystal clear, but also for what the prophets called righteousness and justice, or for what I would call the healing and restoration of the world. So this is a story, obviously, about injustice, about the world as it's not supposed to be, about the breakdown and the implosion of a family, interesting. But when you drill down, it's about a child, a little boy at that, who is oppressed by the demonic. And you see the sadistic intent of the demonic. It's to kill him, right? Fire, water, to kill him. That is the Satan's agenda. He's sick. He's twisted. He wants to kill children. That's why so often where we see the overlap between the demonic and injustice all around the world, not only in the developing world, but here in this city, so often we see the enemy go after children. I was at it last night. It's a confidential thing that I was praying with a family last night late. I'm tired this morning because there's demonic stuff. There's a family member that is open now to the demonic and the way that it's wreaking havoc on the kindergarten boy. And the symptoms and like crazy stuff. And Jesus has power and Jesus has authority, and we pray and we hope for the future, but it's sick. The enemy is sick. Fast forward today, there are children all over the world who are oppressed, both by men and I would argue by the demonic. I think of the millions of orphans in sub-Saharan Africa due to HIV/AIDS. Here in the US, I think of the cascading number of school shootings. You're telling me that the demonic has nothing to do with that? Here in this city, I think of the thousands of children in foster care. I mean, listen to these stats. These are a few from the last year or two. Next slide. 3,178 children are in foster care in the Tri-County area alone. 868 new non-relative families are needed to cover that. And by the way, some of those are you. I'm just saying, right? We could stop that. We being the church in Portland, we could stop that. 74,000, this is in 2011, 342 reports of suspected child abuse. Of those that were prosecuted, here's the breakdown. Sexual abuse, 906. Physical abuse, 977. Mental injury, 184. Neglect, 4,929. Threat of harm, 7,288. Followers of Jesus in the city of Portland, several hundred thousand. The odds are in our favor, my friends. But this right here is why we do hear the cry, which is justice work, locally, globally, inside, outside the church. But to be honest, the vast majority of Hear the Cry, the vast majority, that 10%, you give $10 and $1 goes out the door, the vast majority goes to partnering with God for the healing and restoration of children here in Portland through foster care, and then for the most part around the world. This is why we give week in and week out, while we pray over the offering. This is why we have the giving catalog. If you don't have one, make sure on your way out you get one. I mean, what is more fun than getting together with your family and buying a goat for somebody in Zimbabwe? It's absolutely fantastic. It's why we have the foster kid bags that are right out there. We need 250 of them, where you take a bag and you fill it up with a bunch of goods, and then we pass it out to kids in need. We need every single one of those gone by the end of the day. Can we do that? 250, every single one gone by the end of the day. It's why we took an offering last week for families in need right here in this church. By the way, the offering was $42,512. Well done. Well done. That's on top of the regular offering. Well done. So proud of you. And Barry's going to come later. Thanks for the Christmas tree. I think that was $6,000 of it right there. This is why we set aside 10% of the budget in a church where the median age, not at the 8, no offense, but is about 25 or so. And we're barely making ends meet right now. We're just hoping and praying that we finish the year in the black. What's your goal right now? What's your dream for the church, John Mark? Finish the year in the black. That's my hope. That's my prayer. But still, 10% right out the door. Even in a church like ours, it doesn't have a ton of cash. 10% right out the door. This is why we do all of it. But that said, we want justice to be something that we do, not just something that we give to. Right? Now, both are good, right? I don't want to stop giving. I know you don't want to stop giving to those in need. But I want to actually do justice, not just give money to other people to do justice. Not to downplay that. That's fantastic. But I want to actually do it because I don't have to look far for injustice. I don't have to get on a plane and go anywhere. There's injustice right here in my city, all over the place. There's injustice in my neighborhood. There's injustice on my street. There's the demonic on my street. My guess is that I'm not alone. So as followers of Jesus, our agenda, right, our calling, our job description is to carry on Jesus' kingdom work, right? To carry on Jesus' dream of the healing and the restoration of all creation. That's our calling. So what in this story, as followers of Jesus, as disciples, if we don't want to end up like the 9 who are sitting there with the teachers of the law in the crowd and the dad going, I don't know, it's not working this time, right? If we don't want to end up there, what can we learn from Jesus right here about justice, in particular about how to do justice? Well, really fast before we wrap up, 3 things, all from the story. First off, if you're taking notes, justice is spiritual. At a surface level, there's a boy with epilepsy, but under the surface, there is a demonic spirit at work. So often when it comes to injustice, what we're dealing with is spiritual in nature. Justice isn't just about fair trade, economic policy in Washington, or less corruption in government and the developing world. It is absolutely about that. But it's also about a whole lot more. It's about what Paul in the New Testament called the kingdom of darkness and its grip on the world that we call, the post-Eden world that we call home. But Jesus has power over all of that. Do you believe that? And as followers of Jesus, when we live a life of intimacy with God, we, in the Spirit of Jesus, we have power and authority over all of that. So when you see injustice in your neighborhood, in my case, on my street, I see the demonic on my street every day, all right? When you see that, you don't have to run and hide. You're called to fight. You're called to pray, to live in intimacy with God, and to partner with him with power and authority when there's demonic stuff that you bump up against, like the dad I was with last night. You have power and you have authority over it as followers of Jesus, not from a technique, but from your intimacy with Jesus. Open up your eyes. Secondly, justice is not only spiritual, but it's sacrificial. This is really the heart of the passage. Jesus sacrificed his comfort. He came down off the mountain. Now, if I was Jesus, and I'm up there with Moses and Elijah, well, I think I would stay up there for one. I think I would turn it into a retreat center. I think I would charge admission. I think I would put on an annual conference. I would maybe come down off the mountain to do a book tour or 2 about, my time on the mountain or 30 minutes on the mountain or whatever it is, I'd get a CNN, I've been to the mountain and back, whatever, for sure, absolutely. I'd get my 5 minutes. But for the most part, I would stay up on the mountain. But Jesus comes down the mountain to the mess, to the pain, to the ugliness, to the disciples arguing with the teachers of the Torah, to a little boy foaming at the mouth, to a father with just an iota of faith, desperate. Jesus sacrificed all of his comfort, and Jesus sacrificed his time. Like this is an in-depth story, right? It's long. If you think about real estate in the Gospel of Mark, it's a long story. Jesus could have moved on, right? From hey, I'm sorry, Mr. Dad guy, I don't have time. We're going to do a little demon thing at the end of my teaching, but there are thousands of people right here who are waiting for me to teach them. Thousands of people. I have the Pharisees. I don't have a great rapport with the Pharisees. I need to show them what's up, all right? I need to stand up here. I have thousands of people to teach. You're one guy. But no, instead, Jesus, it was stop, ignore the thousands, ignore the crowds, ignore the chance to stand up and to relate to this man. Jesus gave up his comfort. He gave up his time. Obviously, for you and me to do justice, it means just that. It means you will have to give up your comfort. It means you will have to give up your time. And for you and me, it means that we will have to give up our money. Jesus had no money, all right? That's why there's nothing about money. Jesus was homeless, all right? But we do. By the grace of God, we live in the wealthiest nation ever. But at the same time, we live in a world where every other human lives on less than $2 a day. And that's not a guilt trip, all right? I'm going Christmas shopping this afternoon before night church, all right? It's not a guilt trip. But that is a calling from God. This is a moment in human history where we have more resources than any other nation ever. I want to stand in front of God at the resurrection with more to show than a flat screen TV. Although that would be fun. But this is a calling. It's not a guilt trip. This is a calling from God to do justice. But yeah, that hurts. Exactly. It hurts. It's spiritual and it's sacrificial. And then last, if you're taking notes, justice is all about relationships. It's intriguing to me. This was getting at me all week long as I was thinking about this story, that Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? Who cares? He's demonized. Get it out. I mean, do you need to know? I mean, I'm a bullet points kind of guy, all right? I'm not a chit-chatty kind of guy. Hi, what's your name? What's your issue? Okay, cool, let's fix it. That's kind of how I'm wired, right? But here's Jesus, and sometimes he is like that, to the point. But hey, how long has he been like this? The boy is rolling around on the ground, and he wants to know the man's life story. Hey, what's your story? Where do you come from? What's this all about? What's the root issue here? How long has he been like this? How long have you been like this? Why? I think it's because he wants a relationship with the Father. Because that dad isn't just a mark. He isn't just a problem to fix. He's a man to be in relationship with. That's the difference between generosity and justice. Both are good. Do not misunderstand me. Both, in fact, are great. But generosity alone doesn't require relationship. You can give to somebody you've never met. Right? My wife and I sponsor a child in India that I've met, but they have never met, ever. And we send $40 a month or whatever. You can give to somebody that you don't have a relationship with. And that's not bad, that's fantastic. But when it's not done right, generosity can be a handout, right? But justice does require relationship because justice is getting to the root issue, right? Generosity does a great job of dealing with symptoms, and you need that, right? When you're at the ER and trauma, you need some painkillers, right? You need critical fixing. But justice is getting to the root issue. Justice is about healing. You can't do justice without generosity, but you can't do generosity without justice, which is not down on generosity, it's up on justice. We have to get to the root issue, and that means relationship. So who are there, when you see injustice in your life, in your neighborhood, in your street, your work, in your family, around the world, in your generation, don't forget relationship. Don't forget to not just send a check or say a thing or pray a prayer and then move on. Don't forget to ask, how long has he been like this? Don't forget to have somebody into your home. Don't forget to sit down and have a cup of coffee. Don't forget that really the end goal is not to deal with the symptoms. The end goal is to get to the root issue and to see Jesus bring healing. So in the coming weeks between now and Christmas and into the new year, may God open up our eyes to the injustice that is all over the place, around the world, and then here in the city. May God open up our eyes to the children in need, to the families, the fathers and mothers in need all around us. May we give. The way of Jesus is radical generosity. If you don't like that, don't follow Jesus, right? My least favorite teaching of Jesus, hands down, is his teaching on generosity. It's hard, but it's so good. It's the way of radical generosity. But more than that, may we give, yes, but may we do justice. May we partner with God for the healing and restoration of the world, to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. But listen, first, two things before we wrap up. Before we give, before we do justice, two things we have to get, and this is the heart of the passage: pray and believe. That's it. Pray and believe. Pray, this kind can come only by prayer. There is stuff in this city, stuff in my neighborhood, stuff in your life, stuff in our generation that is so dark, so screwed up, so demonic, so hellish, that your only hope is in the power of God. And we're all for hard work and the political involvement and the nonprofit. We're all for all of that. But more than anything, we're for prayer. Maybe you are facing something dark, and just like Jesus, you need to invest lots and lots of time in prayer in this season of your life. Maybe you're facing something dark, and just like the father in crisis, you have barely any faith at all. The only thing you can do is scrape together a tiny bit. That's enough. A mustard seed is enough. Start there. Pray. Either way, know that a life of power and authority goes hand in hand with a life of prayer and intimacy with God. Pray and believe. Everything is possible for the one who believes. What does that mean? It means that faith, listen to me, faith sets no limits on the power of God to break into our life and do the miraculous. That's what faith is all about. More than a struggle against the demonic, this story is about a struggle for faith. Because injustice, whenever you see it, if it looks like a little boy, if it looks like fatherlessness, if it looks like poverty, whatever, whenever you see injustice, it's overwhelming, right? I mean, because we're dealing with a systemic issue that has to do with government all the way down to human nature. It's overwhelming. How can we stand up against the tidal wave of poverty or injustice or fatherlessness in the world? Hey, everything is possible for the one who believes. Because we carry the power and the authority of the God who broke the spine of death itself. A God of resurrection. If you can beat death, you can beat anything. We follow Jesus, who is king over all. So, if and when you see justice, do justice, but first, pray and believe. You know, there are these three characters in the story: the Son, the Father, and Jesus. If you plot it along a spectrum, on one end you have the Father, who's basically, on one end you have the disciples, who are basically a negative example of faith, who don't pray and have little or no faith. On the other hand, you have Jesus, who is obviously the positive example, prayer, faith. And then in the middle, you have the Father. And he's a mixture of both faith and doubt, of trust and anxiety, of hope and despair, of life and death. And my guess is that's where you find yourself. I know that's where I find myself. And so whatever it is that you're up against, may you join with that Father. Lord, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Let's pray. I just think of that line, bring the boy to me. Somebody said that to me a few days ago. Kathy, if you're here. And I'm thinking about it the last few days. What is the boy in your life? What is the problem? What is the issue? What is the prayer? What is the hope, the fear, the dream? In your neighborhood, in your calling, in your job, in your world, in your generation, what is the boy? What is it that is not right, that is not as it's supposed to be? You know, as we step into worship, here's my call for you. Bring the boy to Jesus. Bring it to Jesus. Bring the problem, bring the issue, whatever it is, right here and now. Bring it to Jesus, who has power over all. Just take a minute, Brandon, before you start singing, just whenever you're ready. But why don't you just do that right now in prayer? You want to put your hands up as a symbolic way, whatever you want. Just bring it to Jesus.